Hello, boys and girls. We're going to read the end of our chapter from yesterday about Mary. And remember, Mary, she was talking back to her mother and father. And Mrs. Piggle thought Penelope, the parrot, would help. Did the parrot help? Oh, yes, it did. So Mary was taking Penelope Parrot back to Mrs. Piggle. And her mother said, Mary asked, "Oh, yes, mother, and may I stay to play?" Mrs. O'Toole said, "I think you better come home and practice. Your music lesson is tomorrow, you know." Mary started to draw her mouth, squint up her eyes, and blink, but suddenly she looked at Penelope. And so she turned up her mouth, opened her eyes, and smiled. And she said, "All right, mother, I'll come home right after I return that rude Penelope." Did she learn her lesson? Boy, she did. Thank you, Mrs. Piggle. Now, the next chapter is called The Selfishness Cure. And this chapter is about a little boy named Rick who is very selfish and he does not like to share anything. Let's see what Miss Piggle does to help. Rick Thompson was certainly a nice-looking boy, and he was smart in school and behaved well at the table, but whenever his name was mentioned, people said, poor Mrs. Thompson. She has such a problem. Whatever will she do with that child? I guess that you would feel simply dreadful if people said a thing like that when your name was mentioned. But Rick didn't. You see, Rick Thompson was a selfish, greedy little boy, and he cared more about being selfish and greedy than what people said. When children came over to his house to play, Rick said, "Don't touch that, that's mine. You can't play with that, that's mine. Put down my ball, take off my skates." Each time this happened, at least each time it happened when his mother could hear Rick saying, "That's mine," she would send him up to his room to think about how selfish he was. And Rick would go right upstairs, for he was very obedient, but instead of thinking how bad it was to be selfish, he would sit on his bed and swing his legs and think, "Everything in this room is mine, and nobody's going to touch my things." He certainly was a problem. One day, Rick's mother bought a big box of peppermint sticks. She called Rick into the house and said, "Now, dear, I have bought this large box of peppermint sticks for you, but I want you to share them with your friends. There's about 50 sticks in the box, and I want you to divide them up with all the children in the neighborhood. Don't forget the little children, Rick. You might send 1 or 2 to old Mrs. Bury. She's so fond of peppermint." Rick said, "Thank you, Mother, for the fine candy." And then he took the box out the door and into his basket in the front of his bicycle. And he allowed the neighborhood children to look at the peppermint sticks. But he warned them, "This is my candy. If anyone touches it, I'm going to hit them with my baseball bat." How dreadful. The children in his neighborhood had known Rick for some time, and then they knew he meant what he said. But as they looked at the candy, they wished they could just have one stick. Rick's mother watched from the window and saw all the children gathered around Rick and the box of candy in his basket. She thought to herself, finally, just look at my Rick dividing that candy with all his little friends. I just knew he'd learn to be generous." And she tapped on the window. And when Rick looked around, she waved and smiled at him. Rick waved and smiled back, but unfortunately, just then, Mary O'Toole, who was quite daring, reached and grabbed a stick of the candy, and crack! Rick clouted her on the head with a baseball bat. In a flash, his mother saw what was going on. She flew out the front door, took Rick firmly by the arm, and marched him upstairs, thrust him into his room, and slammed the door. Then she went downstairs and out the front door, took the box of candy, told Mary O'Toole to divide it up among the children, even the little ones, and to take 1 or 2 sticks over to Mrs. Bury, because she was so fond of peppermint. There was 15 children, not counting Rick, and 50 sticks of candy. So each child got, how many? 3 sticks each, and old Mrs. Bury got 5. From the window of his bedroom, Rick watched Mary divide the candy, and he was just furious. After all the candy had been divided, Mrs. Thompson went into the house and called Rick's father. She said, "Herbert, I know you're busy at work, but I am so worried about Rick." Rick's father said, "What's the matter? Is he sick?" His mother said, "No, I wish he were. It'd be much simpler." Mr. Thompson said, "Now, dear, I'm so busy. Can you wait until I get home?" Mrs. Thompson said, "Herbert, this cannot wait another minute." She told him about the candy and the baseball bat. Mr. Thompson said, "Why not give him a hard spanking? Tell him that you're going to give him something that he can keep all to himself." "Now, Herbert, this is not a laughing matter, and I don't think a spanking's going to solve a thing. I don't know what to do or which way to turn." And Mrs. Thompson began to cry, partly because she felt so humiliated over Rick's selfishness, partly because she knew that she didn't know what to do. Rick's father said, "Now, dear, shall I hop into a taxi and come home?" Rick's mother only cried louder. "I just don't know what to do or which way to turn." "Call Mrs. Piggle Swiggle, or whatever her name is. You know, the one who cured Herbert." "You mean Mrs. Piggle Wiggle? Oh, Herbert, you're so wonderful. I knew you would think of something. I'm going to call her right away." And Miss Thompson blew her nose and cheered right up. Mrs. Pigglewiggle, because she knows so much about children, after all, she had about 1,000 little boys and girls come to her house to pull taffy, play checkers, bake cookies, drink tea, and dig for pirate's gold in the backyard. And so she had plenty of opportunity to learn about childish ailments and the cures for them. She was certainly the person to ask about Rick, the selfish boy. And so Mrs. Thompson telephoned her, and she said, "Hello, Mrs. Pigglewiggle. This is Mrs. Thompson, Rick's mother." Mrs. Pigglewiggle said, "Hello, Mrs. Thompson. I've rather expected you to call." "You have? Why?" "'Cause I know Rick very well," said Mrs. Pigglewiggle. "And although he is a very dear little boy and the most well-mannered child who comes to visit me, never once forgetting to say thank you and please, he is very selfish." "I know he is. I know he is," said Mrs. Thompson, almost crying again. She was so ashamed that Mrs. Pigglewiggle should know how selfish Rick was. Mrs. Pigglewiggle said, "Now, Mrs. Thompson, do not feel sad. Selfishness and greediness are just diseases like measles and chickenpox and can be cured very easily. But we must start now before another day passes, because Rick is such a nice little boy. We want everyone to like him as we do." "Oh, do you like him in spite of his selfishness?" asked Rick's mother. "Of course I do," said Mrs. Pigglewiggle. "I love all children, but it distresses me when I see a child who has a disease, like selfishness or answer-backism or won't put away toys at us, and his parents don't do anything to cure them." "I do want to cure Rick," said his mother. "I'll do anything to cure him." Mrs. Pigglewiggle said, "The selfishness cure is actually really simple, but the rules must be followed very strictly. You will have to come down here and get my selfishness kit, and at the same time I'll give you the directions for its use." "Thank you so much, dear Miss Pigglewiggle," said Mrs. Thompson. "I'll leave right now," and she hung up the phone, slipped on a jacket, and ran all the way to Miss Pigglewiggle's house. When she arrived, Miss Pigglewiggle was on her front porch waiting for her. On the porch beside her was a large green metal box with Selfishness Kit painted on its side in white letters. Miss Pigglewiggle invited Rick's mother to sit down, and she opened the kit. Inside were about 25 padlocks of various sizes. There were great big ones, the size of apples, down to little tiny ones not much larger than a penny. Also, there were screws and a screwdriver, a box of cloth labels that said Rick, a box of black gummed labels, a small can of white paint, and a small can of black paint, a small paintbrush, and a pastry bag. This is the large bag with the nozzle on the end. When filled with frosting, can be squeezed, and the frosting comes out on the other end like toothpaste that can be formed into words. Miss Pigglewiggle said, "Mrs. Thompson, these padlocks are for Dick's drawers, his closet, his toy chest, his bicycle, his bedroom door, his nightstand drawer, and his toothbrush. As soon as you get home, put the padlocks on everything he owns and give him the keys. This is to assure him that he and he alone can touch his things. The name labels are to be sewn in all of his clothes, and the gum stickies are to be put on all of his books. Even his school books, notebooks, pencil boxes are to be pasted on his ruler, crayons, and paints. On each sticker, print in large letters with his black paint, Rick's book, don't touch. Rick's notebook, don't touch, and so forth. On every toy he owns, you must paint in either black or white paint. Rick's ball, don't touch, or Rick's bat, don't touch. Put the name of the toy first and then don't touch. The pastry bag is to be filled with a simple white frosting and used to mark Rick's sandwich. His fruit, his cookies, and his plate for each meal. That's all there is to it. I expect you'll be returning the Selfishness kit before a week is past. Mrs. Thompson said, I do hope so, Mrs. Piggle. Are you sure it will work? It has cured hundreds of other children, and I don't see any reason why it shouldn't cure Rick a week or even less, I should say. Mrs. Thompson thanked Mrs. Piggle very much, and then lugging the kit, she walked home. As soon as she hung up her jacket, she began sewing the labels in all of Rick's clothes. He asked her what she was doing, and when she showed him, he was as happy as could be. Boy, that would just show people who owns my clothes, he said proudly. Mrs. Thompson did not answer, but continued to put the labels on every single stitch of his clothing, including his socks and his handkerchiefs. And then she opened the kit and took out the tiniest padlock, and she fastened Dick's toothbrush to the toothbrush rack. With the little padlock, snapped it shut, and handed the key, which was not much bigger than a pin, to Rick. You better find a ring to hold your keys, she said. You're going to have about 25 of them. Boy, that's just wonderful, Rick said, fondling the tiny key and thinking, that's my toothbrush, and now nobody but me can touch it. He was very, very happy. When dinner time came, Mrs. Thompson closed the Selfishness kit and took it downstairs to show Rick's father. She told him about Miss Piggle, and he patted her on the back and said that he was sure everything was going to be all right. And that, where was the evening paper? After dinner, they were upstairs to put some padlocks on, and they were surprised to find that Rick himself had already put the locks on each of the bureau drawers, his nightstand drawer, his toy box, his closet door, and his bedroom door. He also had put stickers on the covers of all his books, notebooks, coloring books, crayons, colored pencil boxes, and stamp albums. On the stickers, he printed in black paint, Dick's book, don't touch. Dick's notebook, don't touch. Dick's crayons, don't touch. Rick's pencil box, don't touch. Rick's stamp album, don't touch. He was very proud, and he asked his father if he didn't think he printed well. His father said, you should be able to print well. You have certainly practiced enough. And he looked disgustingly around the room at the stickers which labeled everything. Rick's brush, don't touch. Rick's comb, don't touch. Rick's window blind, don't touch. He turned to Rick's mother and said, perhaps we should wear stickers. Rick's mother, don't touch. Rick's father, don't touch. I bet he'll wear monogrammed underwear when he grows up. Mrs. Thompson said, oh, I hope not, Herbert. Rick said, come on, Mom and Dad, let's mark all the rest of my stuff. So they worked till 8:30 at night, marking Rick's bicycle, his baseball, his bat, his pitcher's glove, his catcher's glove, his toolbox, his roller skates, his lunchbox, his rubber boots, his raincoat, his Native American suit, his soldier suit, his gun, his wagon. They even painted Rick's dog, don't touch, on Rover's collar. When they had finished, it was time for Rick to go to bed. He kissed his mother and said goodnight to his father and went happily up the stairs, his rings of keys jingling from his bed. Mrs. Thompson sank into the chair in the living room and lit his pipe. I trust that Miss Piggle knows what she's doing, he said, because if this cure does not work, our son Rick is going to be the most loathsome boy in the whole world. Let's see how many check. I think I just have a couple more pages. Yep, let's find out. Mrs. Thompson said, oh no, dear, not in the whole world. The next morning, they heard Rick's clicking and snapping at his padlocks long before they were up. He was a little late coming downstairs because it took time to padlock all of his drawers, his closet door, and the door of his room, but he was very happy. And his mother noticed that he had pinned one of the name labels on the outside of his sweater. While he was eating his breakfast marked Dick's breakfast, don't touch, his mother marked his sandwiches. Rick's sandwich, don't touch, and his apple. Rick's apple, don't touch, and his cookies. Rick's cookies, don't touch. His lunchbox had already been marked, Rick's lunchbox, don't touch. After breakfast, Rick put the lunchbox in the basket on his bicycle and noticed proudly the large sign hanging from the crossbar. Rick's bicycle, don't touch. At school, the children paid little attention to the sign on his bicycle. But when he opened his lunchbox and took out his sandwich, marked Rick's sandwich, don't touch, and the apple marked Rick's apple, don't touch, and the cookies marked Rick's cookies don't touch. Everyone laughed and wanted to see them, and the resulting crowding and pushing one of the sandwiches was dropped and stepped on, and some of the big boys grabbed the apple and tossed it in the air just before Rick's head, shouting, "Throw me Rick's apple. Oh, look, I dropped Rick's apple. I wonder if Rick's apple will bounce." When they finally gave Rick his apple, it was bruised and very dirty. In arithmetic period that afternoon, Bobby Slater, across the aisle, asked Rick for his ruler, and when he saw the label, "Rick's ruler don't touch," he began to laugh, and he reached over and snatched the ruler off Rick's desk and passed it to Kenny Hatch, who laughed and passed it to the girl in front of him. Finally, Mrs. Crabtree had to come down and get it. When she saw the sign, she laughed too, but she gave the ruler back to Rick. After school, the boys decided to play baseball in the vacant lot by Rick's house. But when Rick brought down his bat and ball and mitt, and the boys saw, "Rick's ball don't touch, Rick's bat don't touch," they said, "We can't touch anything, so let's go home." And they did. Rick went up to his room to play, but he found that somewhere during the day he had lost the key to his closet, and that he had locked the key to his toy chest in his closet. So he went down and sat on the front porch and listened to the shouts of the children playing in Hubert's yard. The next morning at school during recess, nobody would play with him, and the little girls followed him and laughed. When they marched into school and the children pointed and laughed, and Mrs. Crabtree came down to see what the trouble was, she almost laughed herself when she saw the sign someone had pinned on the back of Rick's sweater. It said, "This is Rick, don't touch." At lunchtime, the children crowded around to watch and take out his sandwiches, and one little girl said, "He's so selfish and greedy, he had his sandwich marked so he can't share them." Then the children danced around him and chanted, "Rick's sandwich don't touch, Rick's apple don't touch, Rick's lunchbox don't touch." Finally, Rick took his lunchbox out and put it in the basket on his bicycle. But the children followed him, and seeing the big sign, "Rick's bicycle don't touch," they yelled and laughed. "Rick, don't touch Rick. Rick, don't touch Rick." After school, Rick hurried right home, but he had lost the key to his room. So he went down to the basement to play with his toolbox. But every time he saw the large white sign, "Rick's toolbox don't touch," he thought of school and his lunchbox, and he remembered how the children laughed and jeered, and he was ashamed. At dinner, when his mother brought him a plate marked, "Rick's dinner don't touch," he said, "Why did you have to mark that on my plate? I don't care which one I get." Mrs. Thompson looked significantly at Mr. Thompson and said, "All right, Rick, we won't mark your plate if you'll share your dessert with Rover." Rick thought for a few minutes, and then he carefully broke his chocolate cake into 2 equal pieces. He gave one to Rover, who gulped it down and looked grateful. After dinner, Rick told his father he'd lost the key to his room and the closet, and so his father took off the padlocks on those doors and on the toy box. Rick said, "Don't put them back, Dad. I don't care who goes into my room or gets into my stuff." The next morning, Rick got up early and scraped Rick's lunchbox don't touch from his lunchbox, and he took the sign off his bicycle. And then he went into his mother and said, "Mom, please don't mark my sandwiches. Please don't mark any of my stuff, Mom." Mrs. Thompson said, "All right, Rick. I only did that to protect you." Rick said, "I don't care who gets my lunch. Just don't mark it." At noon, all the children gathered around Rick, but neither his sandwiches nor his apples nor his lunchbox were marked. So they rushed out to see his bicycle, but there was no sign on it. So they sat down and ate their lunches. Right after school that night, Rick hurried home and scraped the marking off his ball, bat, and mitts. And then he walked up to where the children were playing ball and tossing the ball, bat, and mitts down beside the catcher, and he said, "Do you want to use these?" "I don't care." And he went back into his own house. In a little while, Mary O'Toole rang the doorbell. She asked Mrs. Thompson if Rick could come out and play. Mrs. Thompson said he'd love to, Mary, but first he must return something to Mrs. Piggle. Mary said, "Tell him to come over to the lot where he gets back, and here are some keys he lost." Mrs. Thompson said, "Thank you for the keys, dear, but thank goodness they belong to Miss Piggle and not to Rick." She took the keys of the big padlocks and the tiny padlock up to Rick, who was in his room, busily packing Mrs. Piggle's Selfishness kit. Do you think he was cured? I agree with you. I think so. I think he was okay with sharing now. We'll tune in tomorrow for the radish cure. Oh, this is one of my favorite chapters. All right, love you.